There we go. Hey, Julie, thanks so much for joining us here today. This is great.
Lots of delay. Yeah, that
So
was
there's
like
a
5 seconds lag. Okay.
there's a 3 second delay built into Twitch.
Okay. Is that just in case I swear?
No, no, no,
Because that just happens sometimes by mistake.
no, no, no. That and we would want a longer delay, of course, if when we bring on Miguel later. Um, no, no,
Or if you had the two of us on together and we started talking politics,
no, no, no. Oh, no, no. um, gosh, no, we wouldn't want to get into something like that. But thank you. I wanted to thank you very much for joining us. This is the second one of these workshop days that you're helping out with. The first one we did entity framework only with ASP.NET Core a few months ago, but this time we wanted to talk about DDD. And some you've seen some of the folks in chat room. They're pretty excited about domain driven design.
so am I.
So and you mentioned you have a couple courses out there, and you've got a bit of background around this. Can you share that with some folks?
Sure. Well, the course actually I did with Steve.
Okay.
It's a domain-driven design fundamentals course on Pluralsight. We did it a few years ago. And my involvement with domain-driven design, actually, it kind of started because of the alt.NET folks who were, like, oh, Entity Framework is evil, Julie's evil. And I was, you know, what really curious about what it was they were so passionate about, right?
Yeah.
And that ended up leading me to domain driven design. And one of the really interesting things is, even though some of my perspective is a lot different than like the core DDD folks like Eric Evans and uh, Jimmy is great because he's also very pragmatic,
Mm.
but they've been
You
really
you're of
supportive.
course referring to Jimmy Bogart, who's
I'm
in our
sorry,
next
yeah.
hour. Just making
So
sure.
every time I'm learning something new or questioning something and I Google it, I find like a 10-year-old post that Jimmy wrote. So that's how far ahead of us he is.
And
Um,
we're not saying
but
Jimmy's old. We're saying he's ahead
yeah,
of
no,
us.
I'm older than he is. It just took me longer to kind of, get to DDD. But yeah, so I've had a lot of support from Eric and the whole domain-driven design community. Even though my approach is a little different, but I'm I'm exposing more people to domain-driven design and helping them benefit from so many of the great ideas in there. And hopefully, they go along a path and evolve to the bigger picture,
Cool.
not just, not just how to use the entity framework to map your classes, right? There's a lot more to it. And the funny part is when you talk about domain driven design and entity framework, you're uh, kind of going a little against the grain right away, because with domain driven design, you don't want to be thinking, the whole point of domain driven design, well, one of the points is don't worry about the persistence, right?
Mm.
That's not the business problem. And I always joke, unless, you're writing the next Dropbox, right? Data persistence is not the business problem.
No.
But eventually you still need to persist your data. So that's why I, look at the patterns, the architecture patterns that come out of domain driven design, and see how, since I use EF, see how EF supports eventually being able to persist that data once you've written that. But you should really be, not thinking about how you're going to persist your data when you're focused on the domain itself.
Absolutely. We know our domain. Let that stuff for saving to the database, that yak shaving around how do I put this stuff in a database, in a data store. Let that doesn't be what we need to focus on. Focus on writing your business logic. Focus
Right.
on building a great user interface.
Right. And another problem that comes sometimes is if people are worrying about, well, I want to design this thing, and this is what the business rule is, but gosh, I need to be able to, store that into my relational database. And so in order to be able to do that, I better change how I'm designing the business classes to in order
Ah,
to support that, right? And that's, that's the big red flag, right? If you have
yeah.
to start doing that, yeah, that's a huge red flag. So let me talk a little more about DDD. I've got some slides. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, why don't we go to the. You have some great slides here that we wanted to share.
Yeah.
Let me cut over to those. And I've
Okay,
got to.
and also I just want to say yes, I am so excited also about going to Berlin, yeah, and about Kandinsky. But first I was like, oh my God, Berlin, I want to go to Berlin. But yeah, Kandinsky looks like it's going to be an amazing event, so I'm looking forward to that.
All right, let me see
And,
if I can. Ooh,
there,
ooh. I'm trying to fix the screen behind us. There we go. I
oh,
think
look
that
what I
works.
got here. Oh, I don't have my hair braided today. Oh wait, I'm missing the book.
The book.
Wait, I got it right here. Okay, look, see. Wait.
Let
Oh
me. Let
God.
me. There we go. That's good. Look at that. You've got the real book, and it kind of looks like you in the illustration. They're complimenting your illustration here in the chat room.
I did not illustrate that, but I would like to say I found that the image of the redheaded woman on a website that is like an open source website for creating children's books, children's stories online. So I didn't feel too guilty. I have to go back and find it so I can source it, but it seemed to be okay, legitimate to be able to take it to use that. And then I Photoshop the book in. I was so proud of that.
That looks pretty good there. That's a pretty
With
good job.
snagged it
That's a
in.
hard one to say. Snaggeted. Okay. The
Anyway,
blue book Quinn is
oh,
pointing at.
there's me in the DDD book, and let me make sure I can actually forward that. So, oh yeah, I'm a little. I have to get used to this delay. I'm like, oh no, it's not working. So that's the book. It's 15 years old now, and still uh, absolutely relevant because it's not about a technology, it's about ideas and,
Yes.
and design and thinking. So it will never be dated. But what's really interesting is over time, more and more ideas are coming out of that. So it's just keeps getting expanded on. So that's the book by Eric Evans, and yeah, me. So domain-driven design, I mostly focus on what's referred to as tactical design, but I want to be really
Hmm.
clear that that is not the only piece of domain-driven design. It's really two parts: strategic and tactical. And I also like to always, constant reminder, the D in DDD is about domain, not about data, right? It's not D for data, it's about D for domain. So strategic design really is, um, I'm trying to encapsulate it. I bubbled it down to these four things: understanding what the business domain is. And that means working really closely with the domain experts, not just going in and say, oh, like say it's a dentist office, right? Oh, I go to the dentist once a year, twice a year, if you're me, a little more often. I know how that works. So, I'll get back to you when I got the app done. Right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, it's a continual process of working with them and really understand. They're a key part of the team in really like all the way through.
Yeah.
And then another important piece of the strategic design is modeling the business process, really understanding the business process. And again, that's how you cannot do that without those domain experts, obviously. And something that's interesting, though, is a lot of times when we come in with some objectivity, we ask questions that bubble up things that they didn't even realize or perspectives they didn't have. You had a question, Jeff.
No, I was going to say that what you're describing there. This is a little bit of what folks in Scrum and Agile say that our business partners, they're stakeholders in our development projects. They're folks who they not only do they have a stake, but with their guidance, it helps us understand the business domain and model the business process. Look at this. I'm having fun with CoreWiki here. And and right, having that person on the team makes that go.
Right.
So, and folks in the
Now you
chat
gotta
room,
duck your head.
yeah, now I gotta.
Duck my head so we can see the next one. I didn't design this.
That's
Wait,
okay. I'll just disappear
wait,
for a
no, no,
minute.
I have a great idea. Just a sec.
I'll come back.
I just can wait.
You're gonna
Also,
write a line,
there we go.
but will it? Will I still fit?
Let's see.
No, it's better if I just turn off my camera here for a second. Let's just do
Oh,
that.
it's not that important. So one of the next one is there's a business domain, and you heard Steve talking about this also. There's really subsystems, almost separate applications, right? Even though they're all part of the same business domain, and you know, you really this takes some guidance and somebody with bringing somebody objective in again to really be able to help you identify these separate subsystems and see that there really are boundaries around them, even though there's some connection points, but that those connection points can be addressed so often by a service layer or something. Like you just all the only thing that really connects them is there's a foreign key somewhere, right? But they're not integral, they're not part of a transaction.
Hmm.
So that actually takes a lot of experience. Um, and I do think this combination of somebody who's objective and people who are the domain experts to work that through. So that's a pretty big part of the modeling as well, identifying that. And then within each of these subsystems, this is a really interesting and important thing. This term that we use a lot in domain driven design is called ubiquitous language. And what it's really saying is that within each of these subsystems, you have it's almost like a dictionary that's specific to that system. So somebody who you might think of as a customer in one particular context, whenever you and everybody on the team and the domain experts are talking or even writing code and you make a reference to customer, everybody knows what it means.
Yeah,
But maybe in a different subsystem, it's not really a customer. It's
it's a client. It's
well, no, maybe
different.
not even a client. Maybe the other subsystem has to do with accounting, and now it's not really a customer, it's an account.
Mm. Okay.
So that language is really contextual to each of those subsystems, and we don't really call them subsystems. We call them a bounded context. But I prefer not to start with a terminology. So within each one of these contexts that has a boundary, the bounded context, we have a ubiquitous language. Sorry, I have braces in, so words like ubiquitous don't come out right all the time. Um,
I know that problem. I had that
yeah.
a long time ago.
So this isn't everything, but this is just, some core about strategic design, right? So a lot of what I'm doing though is focused on the other part, the tactical design, but I just want to not ignore the importance of strategic design, right? We're going to focus on, okay, we've done all that, or um, a lot of times what I do with clients is I start I start where they're at, which is the code and some of this tactical design, but then they kind of grow out. Now, while I'm there working with them, I do a lot of strategic design stuff because we're
Hmm.
kind of re-architecting. But when I'm presenting on like Entity Framework Core and domain driven design, right, I'm talking about the code, I'm talking about mapping. That's totally tactical. So let me just
So
go up a
now
little bit.
the question we have here from Stim Unix is: are you talking specifically about front end, back end, or higher low level language? This
I'm
feels like
talking.
a little bit of everything.
Well, I'm mostly talking about back end, right?
Okay.
The front end is an important piece, but the front end really isn't about your business process, your business problem that you're solving. The front end is how you're going to create a user interaction with with that business process.
Okay.
Okay. Um, but an interesting thing is, with the data persistence, you really can leave that till later, but you shouldn't ignore, while you're going through designing things, you don't want to totally ignore the UI. You do want to go kind of take a look at it. And it's another interesting thing is I'm going to be talking about domain driven design at the International JavaScript Conference in Munich, which is actually that's perfect. It's the same week as Kandinsky in Berlin, and IJS is at the beginning of the week, and Berlin is at the end of the week. So I'm going
Spending a
to be
lot of time in Germany, huh?
and it's a JavaScript conference, and my I'm not a front end person, but and I'm going to mostly, it's going to be taught like it's called a gentle introduction to domain driven design, but I've had to talk to people so that I can at least put some hook into how it's relevant to the front end. And I don't do Angular, but I've talked to people who've said actually the way Angular is modularized actually aligns really nicely with that as well. But a lot of times the user interface is visually and experience-wise is a bridge between, acts as a bridge in a way between the different bounded contexts. Now, the context to talk to each other or share information, they don't talk directly to each other, but to share information or to move from one to another, like, okay, here's the customer, we're doing customer management. Now, for this customer, I want to go to a whole nother bounded context. And we just, you just pass in the customer's ID and then you go to the other problem where the other bounded context is. But the UI doesn't nobody who's using the user interface needs to know that's what's going on in the back end. They just think it's one big connected thing.
Okay.
So the other big part of DDD is, as I said, the tactical design. So this is a representation. There's actually, if you have the book or seen the book, there's a very large map, and this is just a small part of it. But this is the essential part of what's inside of a bounded context. And this is, this might look familiar. It's, your classes, your entities, your value objects, repositories. Now, I'm not a big repository pattern person, but I looked at files you called repositories, Jeff, and they're not like repository pattern per se. They're they're encapsulated uh, functionality, of interacting, the kind of interaction you need to do with interacting with your database.
Okay.
So I like that, right? It's about encapsulating the things you need to do, not just saying everything is, add, update, delete, right?
Right. Add update
Unless,
delete's a good starting point. It's probably
yeah,
not where you want to end.
right. Well, if you have something that is really just crud, there's
Like our
nothing,
to-do list
right?
that Steve
If
showed.
if you're just doing crud, you probably don't need domain driven design, right? The
Yes.
subtitle to the book is about complex systems, right? However, there's a lot of things you can learn from DDD that still will help you write great, design things really nicely, even within CRUD.
Cool. All right.
Um, so what I want to do is with you,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're not going to like do a major refactoring, but maybe make suggestions and play with some of it and give you some ideas. But look at your code base and look to see where we can identify some aggregates, and make them less like DTOs. And I saw, right, data transfer objects,
Yeah.
make them like business objects that have business rules. And an aggregate is aggregate's a graph, right? It's a combination of like a transaction, right? All the things that are need to go together. And the root of the aggregate, that's like the owner, the manager, and it's responsible for all of its children.
Okay.
So we'll take a look and see how we can make some of those things. So it's just an idea of, um, just a look at how you can change things. Let me just see if I had anything more that I wanted to share in there. Oh, yes. Um, so at some point you do want to persist your data,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Just to talk about EF a little bit, EF core a little bit. At some point you will want to persist your data. And so entity framework is, this is entity framework, this map, right?
Sure.
Mapper. But essentially, I mean, there is a brick wall between your domain model and your data model, right? They are not one and the same. And your data model could just be the representation of the EF core model, what the DB context, right? That's your data model.
So, and Quinn is saying here in the chat room that DB set feels like the new repository object, and DB context is your new unit of work. Would you agree with that? With that
Yeah, and
correlation?
it's not even new, but yeah, DB set is in itself a repository. DB context is in itself a unit of work. I don't create units of work, but still, because of separation of concerns, I still create some kind of repository, whether it's, for CRUD apps, a generic repository is totally sufficient, or if it's something more complex, then I create logic to do that work. So I'm encapsulating it. I've seen people say, well, you never need to use a repository anymore because DBset is a repository. But if you're thinking in those terms, that means you will always need to work directly with DBset and directly with Entity Framework Core instead of saying, look, here's what's going to happen. I don't care how it happens, right? That's how you're
Yeah.
encapsulating. Just talk to, I'm just going to talk to the classes where, the, like, quote unquote, I'm air quotes, repository, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not
Mm-hmm.
repository pattern. I'm just going to talk to that. I don't care how it's doing the persistence, right? You're going to kind of hide that behind there. So I still create some kind of a repository.
And I think Well Sahid in the chat room is asking, you can still use some of the patterns we're discussing here in smaller applications, even though they may not be as complex. If it's a small application and you do have some business logic in there that you want to maintain, some of these patterns do apply still very nicely.
Right. I mean, there's a point at which you might say, this is a ridiculous amount of work for this little application,
Mm.
right? And there's a code smell, right, of over architecting. And that's going to be your call, right? I have habits, I have patterns how I design software. And even if I don't need, uh, I don't have a super complex system, I'm still going to be following some of those patterns that I learned from domain driven design because they just work so nicely for me. But I won't go overboard, right? And you as you have your experience as a programmer, you should be able to trust your instincts on that.
Cool. Good answer.
I'm just going to take a quick look here. I see my name. I'm mostly looking over to the left. My problem with DD is not everyone understands it. That's true. I'm being blunt here. Even if the worst team member has to be able to make an impact, that's the same thing with Scrum. You need a team that understands it, else it makes the development process worse. So that's actually that was from M Jom Aa. How do you pronounce these aliases? And DAO. I don't want to talk about DAO. So yeah, I guess it does mean it's
We're
dead.
gonna we're gonna avoid that one.
So yeah, not everybody understands. Not everybody understands domain-driven design. It's true. So I actually talk about how to gently bring these ideas into your team.
Wait,
Uh,
you don't just go marching into the room and just yell at them?
That's exactly what I talk about not to do. As a matter of fact, I've done this talk a few times, a number of times, and I did it most recently last fall at Explore DDD. Actually, I'm gonna be back there this year too. Explore DDD is awesome. It's in the U.S. It's in Denver. a domain-driven design conference. Anyway, I did a talk called "Evolving Legacy Apps and Legacy Software and Legacy Minds."
Okay.
And it's recorded and it's on YouTube. So if you go to the exploreddd.com website, you can find your way through to that YouTube video. Or if you go on YouTube and find I have a like a channel or favorites or whatever. It's in there, and I'll give it to you afterwards. Anyway,
Yeah,
I'll
let's
start.
let's grab that link and we'll attach it to the notes for the hour here.
Great. Okay, so the last couple of things I wanted to say with respect to these slides is I think I already kind of explained. So the data model that is represented here, that could be, the DB context, and the DB context maps to the database. So the idea is, I've got this domain model. It's designed one way,
Mm-hmm.
but my persistence is my database is very different. How am I going to get from here to there? And over the years, Entity Framework has gotten better and better and more helpful at just being a straight on mapper. So
Yeah.
you can use these domain classes and use EF Core as a mapper to persist them to your database. Not always, but that's where I start, right? And that's what I'm always experimenting with and seeing where EF is at, or EF Core is at, with respect to being able to help me accomplish that.
And
Oh yeah, there's
there we go.
the
There's the link in the chat room. Very good. Thank you so much, Champions Bane.
oh yeah, you're expert at reading all those things.
I've been
Um, so,
practiced.
it's not always going to work, right? And then again, that's a good code smell when when you just can't do the mapping properly with EF Core, and you're like, oh well, I better go back to my domain class and make some changes to it so that I can map. That's when you're like, nope, that's when I probably need to have a separate data model, and then have a mapper, like use a mapper between your domain model and your data model, and then EF Core between that data model and the database. And yeah, so EF Core 2.1 has made it even easier. What I'm doing at Explore DDD, and I'm going to also be doing it at Dev Intersection as a post conference, is a full day workshop on mapping DDD domain objects with EF Core.
Yeah, that's sounds kind of important, right? How do we do that?
Yeah, so that's Explore DDD. September 11th is my workshop, and then a Dev Intersection, and I'm doing that workshop as a postcon on Friday, whatever, maybe it's October 6th or 7th.
At
No, November.
Dev Intersection? Dev
December.
Intersection's December.
So December
Oh yeah.
6, 7, something like that.
In the chat room, they're asking if you could put that resources slide back up
Oh, yeah.
so they can.
Oh, yeah. I didn't
There you
know how
go.
to see that. Oh, and I don't have the. We already have a few other links I could add to that, huh?
Oh yeah, look at that.
So this is the resources for a, and the word soon, that shouldn't be there anymore. That's there. This was a regular conference session that I did on EF Core 2.1 and DDD mappings. So that was the shortened thing where I was just showing here, here,
Mm-hmm.
versus doing the actual full day hands-on labs workshop. So,
Got it. All right.
all right. So if I left some time, I mean, you asked me to talk about domain-driven design and entity framework, and that could take up all day. Have I left some
Day.
time
I
to
think
look
we
at your code?
absolutely. We've got about a half an hour to look at code.
Right, because you know me, I like to talk.
Oh, don't we all? My gosh. All right. Shall we share my screen, your
Yeah,
screen? How would you like to do this?
your screen.
We will.
Oh, do via, we could do
We'll do live share.
live share. Oh gosh, do I have it in?
It's not in Visual Studio for Mac. It's in Code.
I'm actually on my Windows machine, but I don't know if I ever installed it on. Oh, or just open up Visual Studio Code. Duh. I'll open up Visual Studio Code and
There we go. Look at that. My green screen's showing.
that
Oh,
question
what
in.
happened?
Yeah, I was all set up on. Oh, you hear Samson going, oh.
She's
Oh,
gonna
oh,
talk.
dog groan as he was stretching.
There we go.
Stalling. Yeah,
Uh,
sorry. I realized I could do this whole thing on my Windows machine. My Mac is all set up. How long is this going to take? Come on, come on. Installing, installing, installing.
while you're waiting for that to install, Quinn in the chat room has a random question. You might not
Ah,
have an answer, but
hey,
why aren't I entity type configurations automatically discovered?
can I just ask the same question?
I don't know.
I don't know. Maybe there's a reason I do not know.
Okay.
I don't have, yeah, I do have an answer, which is I don't know. Sorry.
Uh,
Okay, so now you need to give me a link. We'll do that on.
now I can share my screen and get you connected in.
Right.
All right. So if you
Yeah.
stop screen sharing,
Right. Oh, I did.
no, I'm saying you stop screen sharing, and
Done.
then
Okay.
all right,
And then
and I'm going to set up for our other view here. Da, da, da.
there. And then you're gonna send me a link, right?
Yes, I need to fix this real quick. 1 second, and then
I better
um,
not hit that update because that could take a little while if it's.
nope, we'll be good. And fantastic. And I'm going to put this back up here. All
Oh,
right. Just
knowledge
got to move
base.
things around a smidge. There we go. All right. I
Yeah.
think that works.
I maybe I'd be. I'm trying to think. Maybe I'd be happier if instead of listening to you over Skype, I should listen to you over Twitch, so I don't have that delay.
Well, then you'll have the 3 second delay there.
Let's see.
And I'm going to open CoreWiki and we will go over this way. All right. Now we're on my machine. And I'm going to give Julie a link using Visual Studio LiveShare. For those of you that haven't seen LiveShare is a way for us to use to share one text editor, just like you would with a Google Doc or Microsoft Word. And both of us will get to see and work in the exact same application. So I click the sharing button up here. This is free for anybody to use with Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. We're both going to be using Visual Studio, but if you're on Visual Studio Code, you can run this with any programming language that Visual Studio Code supports with other folks using that same language. And it doesn't connect to Microsoft servers. It creates peer-to-peer connections. So all of your information is private. You've got secure TLS, transport layer security connections back and forth between all the parties that are involved.
Oh, there it is. It's so cool.
And there you can see Julie has joined my session. You can see her initials up here.
So I've got Visual Studio Code open on my computer, and I'm seeing Jeff's code there, and it's even open to. I should look at Twitch. Yeah, I'm looking. Oh no, yeah, I'm looking at the same thing. Now there's a where we
Go ahead and
take.
highlight some code so we can see where you are. There we go. So you can see the little tape flag there where Julie's highlighting and working in code.
It's so amazing.
It is really cool.
I mean, we did it for the first time together on when we did Twitch a couple months ago.
Right. Absolutely. So, very cool stuff that we're able to do to collaborate now.
And we one of us can we can use Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code. Last time we did it, you were in Visual Studio in Windows.
Oh
I
yeah.
was in Visual Studio Code on my Mac,
Yep.
right? I mean, that was
Absolutely.
just crazy. And then, I mean, good crazy. And this time we both happen to be on Visual Studio Code in Windows, but that's not, that's not a requirement.
I'm in full Visual Studio,
Oh, you
right?
are. Oh, it's
2017.
it's just I get confused because you've got the black
Yeah,
background.
I'm on the dark theme here in Visual Studio,
Oh,
and this does also work for folks who are on Linux. So if you're programming Go in Linux with a team, you can bring up to 5 people in and collaborate and work on your project together in Visual Studio Code on Linux if you like, or JavaScript or TypeScript, whatever your project type might be. If,
right. It's about the visuals. It's about the IDE, not the platform, the language you're using or whatever. It's not
yep,
a .NET thing.
absolutely. So it's part of that. We want to help everybody be able to be successful as developers. So very cool stuff. Okay, so this is our CoreWiki project. This is a project that we started a couple months ago with our friend Shane Boyer on stage at the Dev Intersection conference, and we've been slowly enhancing it. And some of our friends that have submitted pull requests that you can see up top on our GitHub ticker that we have up there, they're here in the chat room, and they're interested to see what recommendations we have here for CoreWiki to take advantage of some of these patterns that we're describing.
Right.
All right.
So let's see. What were you showing me yesterday when I went ah?
so
It's
so
waking
right
up.
now we're looking at some of the user interface things. We're not as concerned with.
I can't read that HTML stuff. HTML.
Nah, we're not going to get down into that. And if we look at the actual data objects, and we've started moving them out into a data project way down here, we've now got some models that start to make a little bit more sense, but they're still tightly coupled to entity framework. So our main model in this project is an article. Now, the CoreWiki project is designed to be a very simple wiki using Razor pages and those easy create, read, update, and delete interactions. But we're seeing as we grow the project, you know what? We need to keep track of history. You know what? It'd be nice if people could comment on articles. And there's different objects, there's different concerns that we have as we grow the functionality for this application. And I think it starts to make sense now to think, well, there's a little bit more to an article than just a record in a database because we have things like the history, we have things like the comments that are attached to it. So, and you can see this is still tightly coupled to our um, to our entity framework implementation, right? The article object we're passing around is still an exact mirror of what's in the database, right? So we're starting to violate some of those clean architecture things that Steve was showing us, right? And this is part of that refactoring and growing beyond just simple CRUD like you were describing.
Right. And I have a question.
Sure.
Um, did you reverse engineer from an existing database to this? Is that why it looks like this?
No, it's this ugly because that's how I wrote it.
Just asking. All right. So
Sorry, that was me.
first, the first thing
And
that strikes me when I'm looking at this is that you've got a mix of your domain,
okay,
your user inner your view needs,
yes,
and um, things about your database. And so I know that they're really really handy. I am not a fan of the data annotations. Now there's different
okay,
flavors of data annotations. The first one on line 14, this right here,
yes,
right? Why, like if we were focused only on the domain, I mean there's so much more, right? I mean, we would like back up and what about your business logic, and this is all
mm-hmm.
all of that. But I'm just going to get some of the low hanging fruit. So the first thing I see here is you've got something specific to the database about persistence here in what ought to be your domain. I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be your domain model,
Yeah.
even though it says data models here. Actually, this says data models. Let's see what's inside of your core models or your core. Is there?
So right now, core, right, and this is part of right how we're evolving the application. And right
Okay.
now, we've got some of our configuration things over there at this point.
Okay, so
And
there's this isn't even about ubiquitous language, but it is about language, right? When I see the word core, I think more about this is the core of our domain, right? So I
yeah,
misunderstood that when I saw that. And when I see the word data, I think we're talking about the data persistence, right?
okay.
Where these and when I see the word models, like in I'm looking over here. I oh you can't see me doing that. So I see the word models
Hang
that
on,
you
hang on.
have.
I'll click and follow you. Go ahead.
Okay. I think we're talking about the domain models. In other words, the classes related to your domain. And these are the
These are
domain models.
database models at this
Classes
point.
are what would have come out of your strategic design,
Yeah.
right? So that all confuses me. And and so going back to Steve, right? Separation of concerns, right off the bat. So these if had we been approaching this from the beginning as using ideas from domain driven design, then these things, everything that you've got inside of data would not be together. The models would be separate from those. And I even put those into a separate project. I don't want to go to town here with that, but um oh, right, because Wikidata is a project. Is that its own
It
project?
is a project. It
Okay,
shows up a
yeah.
little on
So
your screen as
that
a
would be the
folder.
first. But that would break a lot of probably break a lot of things, or maybe it would only break the fact that you just need to make some references somewhere. But that would be the first thing. If this were a project that I had been doing DDD, and
Hmm.
even if I hadn't started out that way, just thinking about separation of concerns, I would say, those models, are those your data models? Does that mean you have separate domain models and you're mapping between the two? Or are these really your domain models, your classes for your domain, and Entity Framework is going to just do the mapping for you?
Okay.
So
So
so maybe the first thing to do, and it might break a couple of things, but we'll fix them up quickly, is create a new project to put your domain models in there to separate your domain from your data access layer.
So, would it make sense to just thinking out loud? So Steve showed us he had entity and he had some of his domain objects in his core project. Could we just create a folder over there to contain these objects, and
Well,
then they're
this
available?
I think he was using the name core differently than you're using it.
Okay.
So yeah, like all the things, like you could have a project that is all the things related to your domain for a particular bounded context. I mean, we're not, going that far into the weeds with this, right? Let's
Right.
just say this is a single bounded context. So we could have one project that is about the domain, right? Another project that's about the data mappings, another project that might be some common things that you use from application to application, infrastructure types of things.
I'm going to agree with the comment Ashley just made in the chat room. Um, I, and Ashley
Yeah.
wrote, "I think our core is ultimately meant to be our domain with a little bit of refactoring." And it in
Are you talking about
C17,
this core project, or are you saying just when we use the word core?
I think the core project.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. So yeah, I just didn't understand what it is. So let's
not a problem.
let's go with that that's our terminology.
Okay.
It's funny because we talk about in DDD, we talk about a ubiquitous language that describes a particular the domain within a bounded context,
Hmm.
but we also need to have a ubiquitous language to talk about the higher level of this, about the technical ubiquitous language. So we don't have to go, oh, when I say this, it means that. It's just so everybody's on this, everybody's using a term that makes sense for the same thing.
Awesome. All right.
So, do you want to just create move those models into core?
Let's do that.
Okay.
All right. So I'll create a folder within the core project called models,
Yeah,
or
just like yeah, you're just going to take this whole models folder and plop it into core,
we will
and you'll have to, copy and right.
we will commence plopping. There we go. Now we're gonna need
Is that
to.
just break a code of conduct, by the way, using
No,
that term? Only if you're 3 years old, right? Like
that's right.
I
We're okay. I'm going to remove these from down here. And question from Ashley is: per Steve's example, should these be entities or is models fine?
Well, I haven't gone that far to determine if they're, these are entities or they should be value objects or anything like that. So let's just call them all domain models for now, right?
Okay.
And then eventually you might, consider if they should what kinds of domain models they should be.
Now I'm
Oh, first pass.
right. I'm seeing one or two things that we are going to have to touch up on here.
Okay.
There are references to the Noda time package. We worked on that previously. I'm going to name drop for a second with John Skeet. So we need to bring
Ooh.
in we need to bring in Noda time. Browse. We'll go find that. Go.
And this is what happens when you refactor, right? And I wouldn't do huge refactors at once, like let's change all of this at once because you want to get a feel for what's going to break, what needs to get fixed. But I'm here hand holding you through it, so
Absolutely.
doing little things.
All right. So my using
Another
statements
thing
work.
I tell clients a lot about doing these kinds of refactorings is, it might seem painful, especially when you move something and then there's all these errors. I liken it as somebody who doesn't even have kids. I don't know if I should even be saying this, but I liken it to when your kid you've got a horse riding kid. You've probably been through this, right? God forbid she falls off the horse and breaks an arm.
That was
Oh,
the wife last year.
oh yeah, breaks an arm, right? You go to the doctor and the doctor says, well, bad news, good news, bad news. Good news is, we can get this healed up, but bad news is we've got to re-break it so that it sets properly,
Oh,
right? And that is
yes.
exactly what refactoring is about, right?
Mm.
Like just but you don't want to do a lot at once. So I do this with clients. I spent a 8 hour doing a mob programming refactoring with a client once, 8 people in the room, and errors, exceptions. Every time we changed, there were so many, and we kept reducing them and reducing them, and I that is just the process. But the whole point of me being there was I knew what to expect. I knew how to fix what was going to happen. So I was hand holding them through their first pass at doing that kind of refactoring.
I think Least Fix Point has a great term for that. Iceberg errors. You only see the very tip, but once fixed, there's many more. I
Well,
think you got a good one there.
right. Well, and this is why we have, do you have tests in here? Can you run the tests to make sure the models are still
The tests
work?
don't cover the
Not,
models.
pardon me?
My tests don't cover the models.
Well, so there's a great reason for having tests that are just about the logic within the models, right? If you have some to make sure that adding this or just like certain processes work
And
and
and, and Ashley is laughing at my lack of tests
And
here.
you blew
well,
it!
I blew it. Yes.
this is why what I said before. By the way, Jeff, I wasn't saying, oh, you should watch my testing course. You, what I had said was, first of all, The course is called Automated Testing for Fraidy Cats Like Me,
Yeah.
right? And what I had said was you should watch that to and then hopefully after watching it you won't feel that you have to apologize for not having tests everywhere and or doing TDD or whatever.
Oh no, I'm certainly not apologizing for being. I'm not.
Oh, we're trying to shame you though. Come on. Just kidding. We have to work
That's
harder at this, Ashley.
that's not fair. You got me. All
I,
right, all right.
but anyway, so having the test in place sure make it a little safer to
Yes,
do factorings where you're making big moves like this.
sure.
Anyway, so
A,
now they're
a,
there. It's
a
got
friend of mine used to say he unit tested in his mind. He could just think about it, and he knew that he didn't break things. Whatever. And then somebody else said, "Well, my unit test is
unit test everything for me.
exactly." Go ahead, start thinking about it, Tom. No, I had another colleague who said the compiler is my unit test. If it builds, everything works. I'm like, are you kidding?
So also, why don't you get rid of that models folder inside of CoreWiki data so it doesn't confuse me? Because I kept trying to open it, going, oh,
Alrighty, we'll get rid of that.
oh,
So,
why?
ooh, we're running up against time here. All right.
Surprise, surprise.
I
Okay,
know we're having a good time.
let's do another first pass. I mean, we're not even going to get into doing aggregates or anything like that, but that's okay because between Steve and Jimmy and I, you've got lots of resources for doing that stuff. Like the the course that Steve and I did together, the DDD Fundamentals course on Pluralsight, and also even though it's EF6 not EF Core, all the ideas are the same. The,
Mm,
my Entity Framework and the Enterprise course actually do this. I work on this architecture. So anyway, the next pass I would do is getting rid of the need for data annotations that are specific to mapping to the database.
okay.
Get those into Fluent API mappings in the DB context, right? So you're saying everything related to the data is going to be in the data project defined by the DB context,
But
not in my models here.
okay.
Okay. So this required and max length, that actually is a data annotation. It is doing double duty.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Entity Framework will read that, but I would, you've got to, but I would actually, personally, I wouldn't be using a required data annotation. I, I would be more likely to have some logic somewhere um, in the root of my aggregate. Let's say article happens to be the root of that article, right? Article is in charge of article history. Article is in charge of comments. So
Right. Let me
that
go over there.
but I would have logic in here somewhere else. Not an is valid, but I can't save this unless these things are in existence. As a matter of fact, what actually required anything that's required, you should make a constructor that takes in those things. So hey, why didn't that work?
It didn't pick up the snippet.
Wait, there's maybe I have to do that snippet. There we go. I would have a constructor that what is this string topic? What else is required here? In
Version. Well, version is set with a default.
okay, we don't have to pass that in though. Uh, good is going to be okay.
Scrolling
Good
down, looking.
name.
No, I
Wait,
think
how would it be can you are you saying an author can be required but it can also be unknown?
right. Correct. There's when the application is initialized, right, and the seed data is created, we create a home page that's just a default content, right, and it's not owned by anybody yet. So it's configured with an unknown author right now, and with a author ID of all zeros.
Okay. Let's just go for this. Oh, wait. String topic, string author. I can at least do one thing, right? Author name. What else is required?
So
Oh, wait. Do you, depending on these, also for your user interface?
for depending on what the
Is it re-
required,
these data annotations, like if your user interface, because
it
ASP.NET
is
Core.
yes. Hmm.
Okay, so
So this is
then
a
then you
detangling that we
then
need to
you
do.
want to have you need to have you would have those in a view model.
Yes,
Okay, so I wouldn't have these here, right? Do you understand what I'm saying? So this
absolutely.
is a domain model, not a view model.
Right.
I wouldn't have these here, and I would say, all right, an article doesn't make any sense without these required properties. So what I'm doing is saying the only way to create an article is that you have to give me the topic in advance. You have to pass that
Yeah.
in,
Yeah.
right? So then it's not required anymore. Um, and somewhere you can check on the length, right? Instead of putting max length here, you would have it in the
On the
setter.
view model object. Let that be handled over there.
Right, right,
And
right,
by
right.
using, you're right, by using these annotations, we're giving ASP.NET, we're giving our web framework
Really breaking this
information.
because this is going to screw up your view. Okay, but I just want to give you an idea of this. So then I can just say, topic equals topic. And then if let's see. Oh, and then I would author ID equals GUID, new GUID. Come on.
Well, theoretically, we'd be passed an author object that we could then reference.
Okay, which might be null.
Right.
Okay.
In which case, then it would be GUID.empty GUID for the
Well,
author ID.
if an author object was coming in, then why were you creating the GUID here?
Yeah, I think that's a
Right?
mistake.
Then I would.
I think that's a bug.
I don't see an author object in here, author class in here anyway.
So that's jumping. Here we go. Our jumping context boundaries. The
You did.
author is a
I
user
forgot
object.
to create a branch before I did this. Sorry.
I we haven't committed any code anywhere.
Okay.
So and we're actually out of time.
Okay. But you understand, like, just
Oh, absolutely.
past these kinds of things, right? Like, and then not mapped, I would put that in a Fluent API. This would be in a Fluent API. This is not
Yeah,
relevant to Entity Framework Core because that it
it should pick it
happens
up.
to map this convention, but you need that in your view model. Um, there's so much I could do here. I mean, just, so these things, okay, we haven't done the strategic or anything, and this might even be a simple kind of a crud thing. It doesn't really need to be complex, but it can still leverage these ideas to make still make this better, even if it was just crud.
Yeah,
Right,
absolutely.
like those kinds of things. So hopefully your people are seeing that. I've been looking at this screen and not looking at what the comments are.
They're
And,
they're definitely picking up on this is how we're going to grow the application at this point. These are
right,
good suggestions. They're all things that you're right. We need strong view models. We need a domain object that isn't tightly coupled to entity framework, and then be able to configure just entity framework like we saw from Steve over with our entity framework specific project with
right,
those references.
right. And then, but this is actually a really important concept about, um, the article is not valid without an author and without a topic. So why worry, where am I checking this stuff, right? You're using, you're kind of, if you're asking Entity Framework to check this required, it's going to check it right before it puts it into the database. That's too late,
Well,
right?
and it
So
it
make it
also
valid before you create, don't even create
yes.
it in an invalid state. All right. I got to go to let Jimmy come on in.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Julie. So the folks in the chat room are saying we should have you back and actually spend a 2-hour normal live stream talking through some of these things and completing this refactoring.
Well, we'll never complete the refactoring. You can also, if you need to do this at on your team, call me.
All righty. Very cool. Thanks so much, Julie.
Bye.
All righty. Catch
Thanks,
you later.
everybody.
And she's out. That was great. Oh my gosh. There was so much to learn there from Julie. So many, yes, light bulb moments, Tiger Eye. And these are being recorded. All of this content you will be able to find. Um, it'll be over the next day or two. We'll get it over on YouTube, but the video on demand will be available on Twitch for you, so that you can tune in and review any of the content that we have that we've touched on. If there's things you want to review, and we will attach links and things to all of the content that we've been discussing here, and some of our guests have brought up throughout the day.